We have been going through the book of Matthew, looking at Jesus and his interactions with his disciples. What was he teaching to them? What correction was he bringing to them? How do those lessons translate to us today as his current day disciples? We find ourselves in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 10, reading from the English Standard Version. It reads, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain, and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." So there's three thoughts that I want to look at, because if you look at that text, you can see there's three kind of little categories. It's a very short text. But first he says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven there are angels always see the face of my Father." There's this idea throughout text about angels, and that angels come down, they help do the will of God, they send messages, that there's angels that are assigned to believers to help them and all this other stuff. And it's really cool, it's really neat to read that and do that study. And so here it talks about these little ones that have angels assigned to them, and that the angels always see the face of the Father. And there's the idea of, how do we care for the little ones? How do we love them? How do we take care of them? Do we do it well, or do we do it begrudgingly? Do we despise them, or do we enjoy their company and care for them well? In the culture at the time, kids were often seen as an annoyance, and we still see that in some areas of culture throughout the world today, and in some people's own attitude towards them. And I'll tell you, that is not the attitude that the Christian should have. We should love our children. We should care for our children. We should cherish our children, and realize that the treatment that we give to those kids is seen by the Father in heaven, is seen by our God, whom we care, and that He desires that they would be treated well. And there's no place in our life to despise these ones, these little ones. The text continues with a parable that is quite familiar to many, especially if you've been in the church. Jesus, he tells this story about a shepherd who has 100 sheep. One of the sheep goes astray. It leaves the herd and wanders off into the wild somewhere. It says that the shepherd then leaves the 99 sheep secure in the mountains, and he goes off and finds the other one. And when he does find it, he rejoices greatly that he found his sheep, and then he brings it back to the fold. And so we have this idea here that, and he then goes on to explain it. The shepherd is God. We are the sheep. And this analogy has been used throughout the Bible about the people of God, the church, being called this flock, or, the herd, the sheep kind of thing. And that God is the shepherd. And so there's this idea that we have this church member, this Christian, who then has gone astray, has left the fold, and has gone out into the wilderness, this lost sheep. And that the shepherd goes out and he calls on him, and he finds him. And then at the return of that sheep, when Jesus picks him up again and is able to embrace him, there's a rejoicing, there's a wonderful celebration of that. And this isn't to discount the love God has for the sheep that have always been faithful in the fold, who have never really gone astray, but rather just to say how wonderful it is when someone does come to the Lord. And I will tell you, as a Christian, that should be one of the greatest pieces of news you can ever receive. That around whatever event, a church service, a camp meeting, just someone talking on the street, in a relationship, if someone comes to the Lord, that should be the most joyous news that you can hear. It's wonderful. There's nothing greater than that. And we should rejoice when we hear that. But then he says, "So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." Perish. And so we're not just simply talking about death. I mean, that's in this cursed nature, that's a natural thing. but we're talking about this ongoing, the future, the eternal perishing is what we're talking about here. And saying that the will of the Father is that none of these little ones would go through that, but rather that they would all walk secure with him, that they would all be with him, that they would walk in life to the fullest, that is with God. And so they would not perish. In other parts of the text, it talks about how it is the will of God that all would turn and call him king, that all would come to him. And so I think this really strongly pushes back at the Calvinistic view of determinism, where it says that, God chooses who will be saved and who will not be saved, because the Bible teaches that the will of God is that all would be saved. And so if we have no free will, then everyone would be saved, because that's the will of God. But if we do have free will, to whatever degree, then there is that choice of us, and God's desire is that every human would call him king, would come to know him, would love him, and be loved by him, and that no sheep would go astray. And so likewise, I would encourage you that would be your hope. Sometimes, especially when someone leaves the faith, and this is always hard, I teach the youth, I say that there's a time in your life where you have to choose, is this my faith or is it the faith of my parents? And that's an important thing to teach. But when the decision is made that this is just the faith of my parents, that's hard. That breaks my heart. When I see people that I've known in my life who have gone astray and have left the faith, or they've gone after wrong theologies, and I consider it to such a degree that they have then left the faith and they've gone after some false gospel, or they've just completely abandoned God and they're out living a secular life and all these other things. There's sometimes this, and I'll just be honest, there's a sense of anger about that, and there's this sense of like, how could you do that? Because it's a personal thing, like you were my brother kind of thing, or you were my sister. What we do not want to do is fall into a state of despise, or a state of certainly not hatred or anything like that. But what we want is this hope that, you have left the fold, you have left the herd. My desire is that you would hear the voice of God, and you would come out of the wilderness and allow him to shepherd you once again. And so I would encourage you to pray for those that you know who were in the faith and who have then left it. And pray for those who were never in the faith and who have then left it. And pray for your own heart, that you don't despise these people, that you don't despise little children who can be loud and frustrating at times, but that you love and cherish them, and that you don't despise those who are in poverty, and that you don't despise really anyone. You might despise their ideologies and their lifestyles and that kind of thing, but who they are, you should love and care for that, and desire greatly that they would come to know God as their shepherd, and that we would be able to look at them and call them our brother and sister. I hope that's encouraging to you today. I hope that you, like God, rejoice when someone comes to know him. Honor God in all that you do, and have a great week.